All right. Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful, and thank you, Mandira, for the introduction. It's wonderful to be here after so long, to meet each other in person. And what I'm going to do over the next 15 minutes is really talk about three things. One, the e-commerce landscape in India, give some insights on how consumers shop online in India, and also talk a little bit about what the future might potentially look like. So with that context, just starting on India market itself, as most of you would probably know, we are the 5th largest economy in the world and also amongst the top 4 retail markets. That truly makes us one of the top consumer economies globally. If you look at the digital curve, India has been further ahead, and you can see there about 700 million users are using internet for different use cases today. And you can see that it almost is much higher than the next 3 countries all put together. Now, out of these 700 internet users, million, you see that about 190 million Indians actually shopped online in the year 2021. That's about 15% of the population of India. So suffices to say that India itself is a large digital economy and has robust fundamentals to support a large and growing e-commerce market. If you look at the retail market today, the e-retail market, it is at about $50 billion by the end of this year. And if you look ahead, that $50 billion accounts for about 5% online penetration. So there's a lot of opportunity to unlock going forward, and we expect that over the next 5 years, this market penetration will double to about 10%. And what that essentially means is a market size of about $150 to $170 billion by 2027, and that would mean a 25 to 30% year-on-year CAGR. And this is important to note in terms of the growth that lies ahead of us. If you look at the growth, it's also going to change the shape of the e-tail market from what we know today. India so far has seen a very high contribution of the higher price point categories. So you see the mobiles, large electronics, and all of those. They will continue to grow. I mean, there is, as you said, as we just saw, there's a lot of penetration headroom. They will continue to grow, but what we'll also see is consumers will start spending from high price points to higher frequency categories. And that's actually a very good sign, because consumers essentially are then feeling much more comfortable to shop online, and they start spending more of their share of wallet online versus offline. With all of this growth, as we spoke about penetration headroom, you can see here the 3 bars there. The one on the top is China, followed by US, and then India. You will see that across categories, India has a lot of headroom to catch up with some of the other more developed markets. Suffices to say that there's a lot of potential. Some of those, especially fashion, general merchandise, and grocery, have a larger headroom and will see disproportionately larger growth relative to some of the other categories. If you look at the digital funnel in India, we spoke about 700 million internet users, but let's start at the 450 to 500 million who are using the internet today for various use cases like chatting or for social media or to watch some form of video content. Now, if you look at the number below, which we spoke about, 180 to 190 million product shoppers, you will notice that the top of the funnel, there are about 2.5 times more people that exist today as we speak. As we go forward, if you look at historically and as you keep going forward as well, about 40 to 50 million shoppers will be added every single year. If you look at the last 40 to 50 million that was added, there were some very interesting anecdotes around that. One being that they came from the breadth of Bharat. And we'll talk about the contribution of smaller towns to the shopper base. But the other thing is also the actual mark of Gen Z, the much digital savvy Gen Z consumers. A lot of them actually featured in the last 40 million that have been added to the consumer base. At this rate, we anticipate by 2027, we'll have about 400 to 450 million online shoppers. What we've essentially seen is with every passing year of internet usage, consumers start becoming more and more comfortable to buy products and services online. So that is a trend we have seen, and you will see that a lot of those consumers are actually already here in the top of the digital funnel, and it is about accelerating their pace towards commerce, which we anticipate to happen. At 400 to 450 million, we will be the second largest online shopper base in the world, second only to China. If we talk about the number of shoppers and acquisition, it's important to know what categories play what role. So interestingly, over the years, fashion plays an incredibly important role, and increasingly so, in acquiring the consumer first online. So as you can see here, the data in 2021, almost half of the new shoppers who came online shopped fashion as their very first purchase. What we are also seeing is, in addition to some of the more traditional ones, electronics, mobile, which a lot of people used to buy as their first purchase, we are seeing general merchandise, which is personal care and a lot of non-grocery household needs, which is also increasing its share in terms of the first purchase pie. When you look at this growth and understand, the common question that keeps getting asked is e-commerce really a top 100 city phenomenon? And this is to bust that myth completely, right? Just in the last year, at least one online product was delivered in more than 20,000 pin codes across India. And that's almost like 98, 99% or so. And that's a very important one. So it is no longer a top 100 city phenomenon. This is truly across the breadth of Bharat that consumers have started buying, or at least products were delivered to each of these pin codes. If you look at that and split it, we try to disaggregate saying, where is growth happening in metros, the top 8 metros which have 5 million plus population, or how does it compare to the smaller town India, which has less than 1 million population? This is a picture of actually 2020 and kind of continues in 2021 as well. In the metros, the top 8 cities, 1 in 3 are already shopping online. So it's a fairly high degree of penetration, and amongst them what we see is Bangalore specifically, there is a much higher penetration. Almost 1 in 2 have shopped online at least once in the last year. And then you kind of narrow it further to the relevant age cohort, income cohort, it's a very, very high penetration that we are talking about. So at some level, if you compare Bangalore to any of the other developed or mature e-commerce markets, it's pretty much there. And another interesting thing you'll see here is the northeastern states. So the shade that you see, the darker it is, the higher the online penetration. This is clear testament to the fact that e-commerce has been able to address the access issue, and you see a very high online penetration in the northeast as well. Now, if I move there and look at the other side of India, beyond the top 8 cities, majority of the growth that you see has essentially come from tier 2 plus towns. These are towns which have 1 million plus, 1 million population or below. And you will notice that if you even look at tier 3 and below, 60% of the new online shoppers came from tier 3 or smaller towns in the last year. And that's very important to note. We also saw that the share of women shoppers has gone up over the years, which is a very good trend that we essentially see. And interestingly, the other side of the marketplace, which is sellers, a lot of them, about 40% or so of the new seller base essentially came from tier 2 plus towns. So clearly there is a duality here that you're seeing, which is you have high penetration in the top 8 metros, and the path forward is going to be more share of wallet actually being spent online, while the other way, a lot of the consumers, new consumers who are coming on board, are going to come in from smaller town India. If you look at the consumer behavior online, the advantage of having a lot of data around that, a few nuances kind of stand out, and I'll touch upon a few of those. The first thing is really, if you look at an average visitor who comes online onto an e-commerce app, that visitor spends less than 10 minutes. That time has been increasing over the years, but it's a slight increase, and still it's just shy of about 10 minutes or so. So there's a big call out to brands to say, how do you actually cut the clutter or cut through the clutter and make sure that you actually are able to kind of impress upon the consumer who's spending very little time on the app. The second point there is really about, pictures truly speak more than 1,000 words. So what's an interesting data point, if you look at consumers or visitors coming onto the app, about 50% of them actually visit the image gallery. And in comparison, it's only 5% of them who actually read the detailed product description. So it's very, very clear in terms of what each brand needs to get right and how would you think about your product pages as you're doing that. It's clearly very different behaviors by consumer segment and categories, and there's a lot to be learned with that online data as well. The extent of search, so in terms of, if I start with browse, consumers browse multiple product pages before actually making a purchase. So if you look at the number, it is at least 15 product pages that an average consumer browses before adding to cart and actually making the purchase. Now, this number varies significantly by categories. So if you look at men's sports footwear, this number is closer to 30. If you look at women's western wear, this is closer to about 40. So very different behaviors in terms of how much they browse before actually making a purchase. What's also interesting is how do they use search and what is the lead term they use to actually search for categories, and that also varies significantly. For mobiles, it's very clear. People are very specific about the brand and the model that they're going after, and those are some of the top search terms. If I compare that with an air conditioner, people actually go for the product type and the features. So it's tonnage, it's split or window, and that's essentially how they start searching. Even within fashion, men typically search more by brands, and if you look at women, they go for more the fabric as well as the occasion. Just a smattering of kind of interesting insights and nuances as you're able to get the data, which also kind of talks about how do we market effectively to these consumers. Influencers are continuing to play a big role in terms of helping purchase, and sometimes it's also the role of influencing the purchase, even if it's not the actual purchase, that's actually critical. Thanks to COVID especially, and initially demonetization, you have a huge spike in the digital payments, UPI and others. But still what we see is majority continues to be cash, and cash on delivery is still about 50 to 55% or so. Now with these kind of insights, if we pull back and say, what does the future essentially look like, and what are some of the trends that we're kind of seeing? If you actually look at the last decade or so, it's beautiful to see the two phases that have happened, and Sankalp mentioned this, we are on to the third phase. Pre-2015 was really cautious early adoption. You had a fewer set of consumers trying online and getting comfortable with the platforms. 2015 to 2020 was pretty much the onset of massification. You had a lot more consumers coming on board, and we saw some of those numbers as well that have happened. We truly believe that post-COVID, we are on to the next wave of growth, what we're calling phase 3. And in that wave, there are a few trends that really stand out. First one is really around micro-segmentation, and we'll talk more about that. The second one is different novel models in e-retail that have actually come to be. This is the social commerce, quick commerce, and the likes, and we'll talk about that as well. And the last one, which holds true irrespective of the phase, which is technological innovations around superior customer experience. And so these are the three trends I'll briefly kind of talk about. On the first one on micro-segmentation, we have always spoken about multi-Indias, right? Many Indias, it's a common, it's been there for many, many years that we're talking about. But there's a further level of micro-segmentation that we are seeing, and I'll call out three very distinct cohorts which are important in the context of e-commerce. First one is the small town consumer, tier 2 plus that we spoke about. The second consumer cohort is the lower middle income consumer. So upper income, upper middle income, and now the lower middle income consumer. That's the second cohort. And the third cohort that's there is the most digitally savvy Gen Z. And we are taking from 18 years, people who are potentially buying on the platform. So 18 to 25 years, which is that cohort, which is actually being meaningful. As you can see, each of these cohorts are fairly material. So if you look at the last year, about 3 in 5 shoppers came from small town India. And these small town shoppers are essentially looking at the vernacular as a big way to interact with the platform. You can see the data there. 75% of vernacular users are actually from small town India. It's also interesting when we look at some of the price points, and we took a sample of about 5 or 7 categories. The price points at which small town India, tier 2 plus India is buying is about, let's say, 10% or so difference versus what a consumer would buy in that category from a metro perspective. So still, we are still kind of, it's the more affluent in the tier 2 plus that's coming in and is able to actually buy with a marginal differential in the price point itself. The second category there, 1 in 3 shoppers out of the 190 million that we spoke about came from lower middle income segment. And these are consumers where word of mouth is extremely important. And the way they seek discovery is also very different. So they use a lot of icons to be able to kind of identify what they want. They also use image search quite extensively to be able to get that. They usually start at a much lower price point, and again, fashion seems to be a big part of their first purchase. The third segment, which is Gen Z, is the most digitally savvy, and you will see that they use very personalized filters. They actually spot a trend elsewhere and use image search quite differently from the second cohort to identify the look or whatever they found externally, whether it's offline or another online portal, and be able to look for that on an e-commerce portal. And they also use wish lists quite often to create their short list of items that they could potentially kind of get. Very important aspect in terms of micro-segmentation, and as brands, it's very critical to be able to cater to very distinct needs that all of these cohorts are actually going to need. The second one we spoke about is the different e-tail models. And here, I'm sure all of you have heard about these various models we've put here. It's been a mixed bag. You will see that some of these are at higher level of maturity versus the others, and also the traction that you've seen actually varies across each of these models. If I start with the first one, which is the social-led commerce, there are three models even within that. The first one is really social network-led social commerce. That's the first one. And this is basically a discovery happening on different kind of social media, and the purchase itself might actually end up in an e-commerce platform. The second one that you see is the reseller model, which we have seen a lot in India. And we've seen that at least in the last year, amongst the folks who have taken the reseller model to come in, 40% of them were actually new shoppers. So that's an interesting trend that we have seen. And the third one is actually community buying, which has not seen too much traction in India, unlike China or others where you see Pinduoduo and other models. The second one is around video and live commerce. Again, very nascent in India, and frankly, the most traction we've seen is in China and in Southeast Asia. What is interesting here is just the number of people there who will have access to short-form video. In our estimates, by 2025, about 600 million Indians will use some form of short-form video, and that's an interesting opportunity to be able to tap into. What video commerce actually does effectively is be able to manifest the latent demand that is there with the consumer. The third one is on direct-to-consumer, which has actually done extremely well. As you can see the funding numbers, about $2 billion plus that has been raised by D2C brands. And a lot of them are now able to hit the scale as well, which used to be a barrier earlier on. And this we see that they'd use a mix of their own platform for 1P data, but much more on marketplaces given the growth and a lot more consumer access that they'll essentially be able to get. The last one on quick commerce, of course, saw traction globally as well as in India. But the big question mark there is the viability of the economic model, and a lot of experimentation is being done on that front. The last trend that we spoke about was essentially around customer innovation. Now, if you look at customer experience innovation, this is something that has been there across all phases, as I mentioned. But what's interesting is if we call out three specific ones: voice, vernacular, and AI and AR. Now, you will see that these experiments have also been very different, or they cater to very distinct needs of the micro segments we spoke about. Vernacular, for example, is heavily indexed towards the smaller town consumer and a lot of the lower middle income consumer. So you will see a large proportion, about 70% or so, of the vernacular users coming from the smaller towns. If I compare that with some of the augmented reality, and you have the try at home feature, you will see that a lot more consumers use that for, and they come from the metro and tier 1 towns. So these innovations also cater to different consumer segments, micro segments, and their distinct needs. What we also see is that all of these have seen massive growth, 5x growth in voice, 3x growth in vernacular over the years. And it's also interesting what people look for. Coming back to fashion as a big acquisition engine, most of the vernacular searches actually happen in the fashion category. Finally, on AI and AR, we see augmented reality use cases actually gaining scale. So whether it's the virtual try-on, whether it's the product demos that you can try out, or as we said, try at home. You buy a large furniture, you buy a large, let's say a large electronics item, you're able to actually visualize it at home and make the right choices, almost trying to closely simulate your offline experience online. Net-net, there's a lot in terms of what's lying ahead in terms of e-commerce for India. We are at 5% penetration, and over the next 5 years, if we double that to 10%, we are talking about 400 to 450 million Indians shopping online, and that will result in about $150 to $170 billion market for e-commerce. Some of these trends are going to have a big impact for brands and e-tailers in terms of how this shapes ahead. And I think there can't be more exciting, and the topic is very apt. It's truly infinite possibilities for e-commerce ahead. Thank you.